Things are starting to heat up in the Big Sky Conference. You have Idaho State, UC Davis, Eastern Washington, amongst others, vying for not only the top spot, but also the at-large bid in the FCS playoffs. Let's take a look at the remaining schedule, or the upcoming schedule for this week, and the standings in the Big Sky Conference.
The Grizz make the trip to southern Utah to take on the Thunderbirds. Montana State welcomes in Cal Poly. North Dakota visits Idaho. Portland State welcomes in Idaho State. Number 5, Eastern Washington visits Northern Colorado. Weber State welcomes in 2-6 Sacramento State. And the number 6 Aggies of UC Davis will take on the Lumberjacks of Northern Arizona. Over to the standings. UC Davis sits undefeated with a perfect 5-0 record in conference, and trailing by 1 game is the Eastern Washington Eagles. Weber State and Idaho State both at 3-1. Portland State and Montana both with 2 losses in conference. Cal Poly, Northern Colorado, Montana State, and Northern Arizona are all sitting at 2-3, followed up by Idaho, Southern Utah, and Sacramento State.
There were 3 conference games on the schedule in Week 9, and in all 3, they had the same theme, with the road team coming out victorious each time. 2 of those 3 games were decided by 28 points. Before we get into this week's action, let's take a look back at the weekend that was. In the conference's only close matchup of the weekend, Monmouth came away with a 10-point win over Presbyterian, 24-14. The Hawks led 3-0 at the half, and the game's first touchdown came in the opening minutes of the third, when Derek Cureton picked a fumble up and took it 41 yards to the house to put the Blue Hose up 7-3. But at the end of the quarter, Kenji Bahar found Reggie White Jr. on a 40-yard pass play to help Monmouth retake the lead. The same duo hooked up early in the fourth, this time on a 37-yard score to put the Hawks up 10. The Blue Hose stuck around as John Walker connected with Dante Myers for an 11-yard score with just over 6 minutes left to cut the lead back to 3. But then later in the fourth, Vinny Grasso found the end zone on a 27-yard run to put the Hawks back up 10 and ice the win. Bahar completed 18 of his 35 passes for 268 yards and 2 scores. White Jr. reeled in 6 passes for 117 yards, and Lonnie Moore IV had 6 catches for 107 yards. For the Blue Hose, Walker completed 23 of his 42 attempts for 191 yards and a score. Keith Pearson had 9 catches, and Deshaun Davis had 8 in the loss. Gardner Webb traveled to Campbell and picked up their first conference win thanks to a 35-7 victory over the Fighting Camels. The Running Bulldogs led 13-0 after the first quarter and 28-7 at the half before rounding out the scoring in the third. Quarterback Jordan Smith completed 11 of his 20 attempts for 167 yards and 4 touchdowns. All 4 touchdown passes were over 20 yards, with 2 of those scores going to Kyle Horton. Smith also added 45 yards on 12 carries on the ground. Running back A.J. Moses rushed for 100 yards on 18 carries and a score. For Campbell, Jason Diamond completed 25 of his 43 attempts for 273 yards and a score. The TD pass was a 26-yarder to Caleb Sneed, who caught 7 passes for 119 yards. Number 2, Kennesaw State won their 8th straight Big South contest after a 38-10 win at Charleston Southern. Dual-threat quarterback Chandler Burks was involved in all 3 first-half touchdowns for the Owls. He was trying to account for a 4th, but senior defensive back James Allen had other ideas as he picked off Burks and returned it 100 yards to the house to cut the deficit to 2 scores. The Owls' defense pitched a shutout in the second half as their offense scored once in the third and once in the fourth to round out the scoring. Burks completed 11 of his 18 passes for 192 yards and 2 scores. He also added 102 yards and 2 more scores on 23 carries on the ground. Darnell Holland rushed for 84 yards on 7 carries and had a 65-yard touchdown catch. All of Charleston Southern's points came from either their defense or special teams, as Kennesaw held the Buccaneers to just 186 total yards and 1 for 10 on third down. Before we get into Week 10, let's take a look at the updated Big South standings. Number 2, Kennesaw State sits alone at the top at 3-0, with Monmouth right behind them at 2-0 in conference play. Charleston Southern and Gardner Webb are both 1-1, while Campbell and Presbyterian are sitting at the bottom, both winless. All 6 teams are in action once again this weekend, and all 3 teams that picked up wins on the road last week return home for Week 10. First, Monmouth hosts Charleston Southern. The Hawks have won 4 straight and bring in the nation's 22nd best offense combined with the FCS's 12th best rushing defense. Monmouth has a very balanced offensive attack, ranking in the top 35 in both passing and rushing yards. Charleston Southern has the FCS's 13th best defense, which is led by the nation's best pass-stopping defense. The Buccaneers have allowed just over 131 yards per game through the air this season. Now, Monmouth's quarterback Kenji Bahar has thrown for over 230 yards in all but 2 games this season. So if Charleston Southern pulls off the win on the road, it would mean they stopped Bahar and receiver Reggie White Jr., something that not many have been able to do this season. And one of the more interesting notes from this one, the Hawks have allowed just 1 made field goal in 8 games this season. The Presbyterian Blue Hose will look to pick up their first Big South win on the road at Garner-Webb. Presbyterian has lost 4 straight games, while the Runnin' Bulldogs just ended their 6-game slide with a big win on the road over Campbell. The offensive struggles have been the primary issue for both teams this season. Both own bottom 20 offenses, and both teams are scoring less than 18 points per game. The difference maker in this battle is the defenses. For Garner-Webb, theirs ranks in the bottom 15 in the FCS, but for the Blue Hose, they have the nation's 35th best defense. Both Presbyterian wins have come against non-Division I schools, and this could be the weekend they pick up their first D1 win. The 7-1 Kennesaw State Owls will put their number 2 ranking and 8-game Big South winning streak on the line as they host 5-3 Campbell. It's been a slow start for the Fighting Camels as they're still searching for their first conference win. In their 2 losses, they've been outscored 73-28, and it doesn't get any easier this weekend. The Owls are one of the most well-rounded teams in the nation. They have the 14th best offense that is averaging about 370 yards per game on the ground. Kennesaw is also averaging 46.9 points per game, the second most in the nation, and their 7th-ranked defense allows just 12.1 points per game, the 5th fewest. Campbell had been pretty good on both sides of the ball up until this 2-game slide, but they were playing nowhere near the level they need to play to defeat the nation's 2nd-ranked team. The Owls' streak should climb to 9, while Campbell will have to wait another week to pick up conference win number 1. That's all for this week in the Big South. Come back next week for all the results and more. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Frank LaSala.
This week in the CAA, in what has been one of the more competitive leagues top to bottom, the Rhode Island Rams are fighting for their playoff lives. They have a big game this week. Let's take a look at who they play and the standings in the CAA.
The Wildcats head down south to take on the Richmond Spiders. Albany welcomes in number 13 Delaware. Rhode Island, trying to keep their playoff hopes alive, travel to number 8 Elon. Number 3 James Madison takes the show on the road and heads to New Hampshire. And in the conference game of the week, we see the number 23 Maine Black Bears head to Maryland to take on the number 15th ranked Towson Tigers. Taking a look at the standings, we have a logjam at the top, with Towson, James Madison, Delaware, and Maine all sitting at 4-1. Elon just behind them with 3-1. Stony Brook sitting at 4-2. Coming in just behind them is Rhode Island, William and Mary, Richmond, and New Hampshire. Villanova and Albany still looking for their first conference win on the season.
The Ivy League features 2 of the outstanding teams in the FCS this season in the Dartmouth Big Green and the Princeton Tigers. Both teams play each other this week in our Stats FCS Game of the Week. But let's take a look around the Ancient 8 and see who else has a big matchup in Week 10.
The 5-2 Quakers head to upstate New York to take on the Big Red of Cornell. The New York-Boston rivalry continues as Columbia heads to Harvard. Yale will welcome in the Brown Bears, and the Stats FCS Game of the Week sees number 24 Dartmouth head down to New Jersey to face number 18 Princeton. Looking at the standings for the Ivy League, Princeton and Dartmouth both perfect on the year, 4-0 in conference and 7-0 overall. Yale, Penn, and Cornell all at 2-2. Columbia and Harvard both 1-3, and Brown still searching for their first conference win.
Talk about a team on the playoff bubble. You look at the North Dakota Fighting Hawks coming off of a tough loss last week to Weber State, but there's still a lot of football left. And the way the schedule sets up for the Fighting Hawks, they could find themselves in the at-large conversation if they can win out. But let's take a look at the rest of the standings and the schedule this week in the Independents.
Hampton heads up north to take on SUNY Maritime. North Alabama welcomes in Shorter University. And North Dakota travels back into the Big Sky to take on Idaho.
Week 9 was full of upsets in the MEAC this past weekend, while Florida A&M continues to surge toward the postseason. The Rattlers defeated Morgan State by a score of 38-3. South Carolina State defeated Howard 27-21. Savannah State crushed Norfolk State 32-3. In other action, Delaware State defeated the NC Central Eagles 28-13, while Bethune-Cookman was crushed by Nebraska 45-9. Florida A&M remains at the top of the standings, undefeated at 5-0 in conference play, while North Carolina A&T sits at 3-1, still hoping for an at-large berth in the FCS playoffs. South Carolina State and Howard round out the top four at 3-2, while Bethune-Cookman and NC Central sit at 500. As we head down the stretch in the MEAC regular season, there are some critical games on the schedule in Week 10. NC Central hosts NAIA opponents Edward Waters College. The Hornets of Delaware State host Savannah State, while Bethune-Cookman will travel to Morgan State to take on the Bears. And North Carolina A&T will host the Spartans of Norfolk State. But this week's feature game will see conference favorites Florida A&M taking on the go-go offense of the Howard Bison in Washington, D.C. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm David Hassagen.
Welcome to Week 10. With only 3 weeks left in the season, here are the conference standings. The Bison are 8-0. The Jacks, the Panthers, and Leathernecks are all 3-2. The Redbirds, Sycamores, Bears, Yotes, and Penguin Nation are all 2-3, and the Salukis are 1-4. Let's take a look at Week 10 as Indiana State hosts South Dakota. Number 14, Illinois State travels to Northern Iowa as the Redbirds hope to break their 2-game losing streak and the Panthers try to keep their slim playoff chances alive. Western Illinois travels to Southern Illinois as quarterback Sean McGuire looks to have his 5th 300-yard passing game of the season as the Leathernecks are undefeated when he does. Penguin Nation travels to the Fargo Dome to take on the number 1 Bison. And finally, in the game of the week, Missouri State travels to number 7 South Dakota State. Both teams are coming in with unstoppable offenses as Bears quarterback Philip Kuslik comes off a 400-yard 4-TD performance while Jacks QB Taryn Christian just continues to break conference records. The key to this game will be if the mighty Bears defense, which has been key in knocking off 2 ranked opponents this year, can rebound off their poor performance last week to stop this unstoppable Jacks offense and keep their slim playoff chances alive. Now to this week's Conference Players of the Week. Offensive honors goes to Southern Illinois quarterback Matt DeSomer for his 206 passing, 92 rushing yard, 3-touchdown performance. Defensive honors goes to Indiana State linebacker Jonas Griffith, who had 14 tackles, including 11 solo stops. And special team goes to Indiana State kicker Jerry Nunez, who was 3 for 4 in field goals and 4 for 4 on extra points. For the Missouri Valley Football Conference on Football Gameplan's FCS Whiparound, I'm Brian Sullivan.
We've seen the conference in the NEC go back and forth between Sacred Heart, Central Connecticut State, Bryant, Duquesne. All have spent at least a week at number 1. So this week we have a lot of separation games, I like to call them, in the conference. Let's take a look at the standings and also the upcoming Week 10 schedule.
3 games on the slate for the Northeast Conference this weekend. Robert Morris is going to travel to Connecticut to take on Sacred Heart. The Red Flash will welcome in the Bryant Bulldogs. And Duquesne makes the trip out to Staten Island to take on Wagner. Sacred Heart sits atop the Northeast Conference with a perfect 3-0 record. And within striking distance, you have Central Connecticut State, Duquesne, and Bryant. Wagner and St. Francis both sitting at 1-2, and Robert Morris still looking for their first win.
The Ohio Valley Conference has been quite competitive this year. You have Jacksonville State, Murray State, and the top team in the conference right now, Southeast Missouri State, playing some great football. But let's take a look at the Week 10 schedule and the standings in the conference.
UT Martin takes the trip down south to Alabama to take on number 10 Jacksonville State. Number 25 Southeast Missouri State welcomes in the Tigers of Tennessee State. Murray State heads to 0-8 Tennessee Tech. And a couple of 4-4 teams go head-to-head as Eastern Kentucky visits Austin Peay. Starting to get some separation in the standings as number 10 Jacksonville State sits at 5-1 in conference, followed up by number 25 Southeast Missouri State and Murray State, both at 4-1. Eastern Kentucky at 3-2, Tennessee State, Austin Peay, and Eastern Illinois all with 2 wins in conference. UT Martin at 1-4, and Tennessee Tech winless in conference.
The end of October brought a close game and 2 huge blowouts in the Patriot League. Lafayette traveled to Fordham and took care of business, winning a close game 21-13. The rushing game paced the Leopards to a tune of 280 yards while shutting out Fordham in the second half. Holy Cross never gave Lehigh a chance in this game. Dropping 28 points by halftime, they finished with a staggering 56-0 scoreline. Over 400 yards rushing, with Dominique Cozier leading the way with 24 carries for 208 yards and 1 rushing touchdown. The defense for Holy Cross didn't want to be left out, though, as they contributed 4 fumble recoveries in the game. This gave the Crusaders their first conference victory of the year. And in what I touted as the game of the year in the Patriot League did not quite live up to expectations. Colgate dismantled Georgetown 38-0. The hammer came with less than 30 seconds to go in the half when Alex Wisniewski intercepted Georgetown quarterback Gunther Johnson and took it to the house for a 55-yard return. Colgate headed to the locker room at halftime with a 24-0 lead. Finishing with 2 more touchdowns in the fourth quarter, Colgate has certainly made its name known as they moved up 4 spots to number 12 in the national rankings. Next week, Bucknell travels to Lehigh and Holy Cross travels to Lafayette. Colgate will travel to Fordham, hoping to move to 8-0. Lafayette needs a win against Holy Cross to keep alive a chance at gaining a 500 record for the year. Georgetown has the week off and a chance to regroup after that thrashing they took. With only 3 weeks remaining, we'll see which schools can finish on a high note and if Colgate can continue its run into the playoff picture. This has been the FCS Whiparound. I'm Joel Smuss.
Talk about one of the surprise teams in the Pioneer League. You have to talk about the Stetson Hatters. They find themselves at 6-1 on the season, trying to get some help to take the top spot away from San Diego, who has a big game this week themselves. So let's take a look at the standings in the Pioneer League and the rest of the Week 10 schedule.
Jacksonville will host Butler. Valparaiso makes the trip to Poughkeepsie to take on the Red Foxes of Marist. Morehead State travels to 6-1 Stetson. And in the Pioneer Game of the Week, 5-2 Drake will host San Diego. Still a tight race in the Pioneer League as San Diego leads everyone with a perfect 5-0 record in conference, followed up by Stetson, Drake, and Marist, all 4-1. Dayton 3-3. Morehead State and Davidson with 2 wins. Valparaiso and Butler both 1-4, and Jacksonville waiting on their first conference win.
The Wofford Terriers took care of business last week and remain atop the SoCon standings. This is a big-time week within the conference. Chattanooga needs a win to keep their playoff hopes alive. Let's take a look at the schedule and the standings in the Southern Conference.
Chattanooga heads to Furman. VMI will host Tusculum. Number 22, East Tennessee State visits Mercer. Sanford hosts number 9, Wofford. And the Citadel will visit Western Carolina. Things couldn't be more crowded at the top of the SoCon with number 9 Wofford and number 22 East Tennessee State, both at 5-1. Chattanooga sitting right behind them at 4-2. Mercer, Sanford, and Furman all clog up the middle at 3-2. The Citadel, Western Carolina, and VMI round out the conference.
When you look at the Southland Conference, there are 4 teams that quickly come to mind: the Nichols Colonels, McNeese State Cowboys, Sam Houston State, and also Central Arkansas. All are fighting for their playoff lives, in my opinion. This conference may only get 2 teams, maybe even 3, depends on how you look at it, but we'll see who is on the schedule this week and who has must-win games, in addition to taking a look at the standings.
Northwestern State heads to Abilene Christian. Number 20 Nichols goes to Houston to take on the Huskies. Incarnate Word welcomes in number 21 Sam Houston State. Number 11 McNeese heads to Southeastern Louisiana. And number 19 Central Arkansas will host Lamar. Tight race at the top of the Southland right now with McNeese at 5-1, Central Arkansas, Sam Houston State, Nichols, and Incarnate Word all at 4-2. Lamar and Abilene Christian coming in at 3-3. Southeastern Louisiana, Northwestern State, Stephen F. Austin, and Houston Baptist round out the conference.
With the firing of head coach Tony Hughes, the Jackson State Tigers will be once again looking for a new head coach to head their program. And this program has been doing a solid job this season, 3-4 in a year, but they want to find that it factor to help their program get back to where they want it to be. But that's Jackson State's news, but there's other big things going on in the SWAC this week. Let's take a look at the standings and the Week 10 schedule.
In the East, Alcorn State leads everyone at 5-1, followed up by Alabama A&M, Jackson State, Alabama State, and Mississippi State. In the West, Southern at 4-1 has a slim 1-game lead over Grambling at 3-2. Prairie View A&M, Texas Southern, and Arkansas Pine Bluff all round out the conference. Taking a look at the schedule, Texas Southern is going to travel to Alabama State. The Tigers of Grambling will host the Mississippi Valley State Delta Devils. Prairie View A&M travels to Mississippi to take on Jackson State. Alabama A&M takes on 1-7 Arkansas Pine Bluff, and Alcorn State travels to New Mexico to face FBS opponent New Mexico State.